fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 27, Go Big Foot or Go Home. Just lay low. Keep out of trouble. Wait it out and then return to the present. Easy! Eric rolled his eyes as his sarcastic inner voice chided him for his foolish plan. He rubbed his cold fingers up his chilly, bare arms, attempting to coax some warmth into his body. He'd left his coat back in the volcano, because why would you wear it there? An action he now regretted after having spent 3 days in the autumn Oregon wilderness. He stared longingly at the bush in front of him, filled with little red huckleberries. He was debating if they were ripe enough to eat when a loud noise made him jump. Here in the woods, there were any number of dangerous... Oh, nope. That was just his stomach. 3 days. No food, no water, and, Eric grumbled internally at this, no toilet paper. He massaged at his gut with a hand. At least you've got our cash for company. He groaned at that tiny, sarcastic voice, returning his attention to the berry shrub. He knew the fruit wasn't poisonous, but when they were unripe, they tended to cause gastrointestinal discomfort. A fact he only knew because he had eaten a handful on his first night and learned the hard way. But he was so hungry. The stomach pains were almost enough to forget the fact that his feet were jammed uncomfortably tight in his shoes, as neither he nor Artemis had considered foot size when creating and attaching mechanical toes. Throwing caution to the wind and his head back in frustration, Eric plunged a hand into the bush, ready to roll the digestive dice, when his fingers brushed against something fuzzy. Panic overtook his frazzled mind, and he fell flat on his ass, scrambling away with a series of embarrassing noises. Heart hammering in his ears, he waited for whatever animal he had goosed to burst free and make a meal of him. But as the moments ticked by, he realized that perhaps he wasn't doomed to become an appetizer. Just yet. He crawled back to the bush on all fours and bravely, no, stupidly, parted the branches and leaves to see an absolutely horrendous handmade beanie. It was knitted with coarse, chunky yarn in shades of brown and orange, with a faded bird-picked pom-pom at the top. He grimaced at the frayed object. Someone had lost it, or maybe ditched it out of a sense of stylish self-preservation. Logic and common sense told him to leave it put, but at the fear of losing another part of his body to frostbite, Eric tore it free and, after checking it for spiders, he rammed the horrid thing onto his head. Though it brought a modicum of warmth to his numb ear tips, it did little for the growing monster in his stomach. Worse still was his thirst. Without potable water soon, he was going to be in serious trouble. He was already half delirious, and, looking at the berry bush, another round of diarrhea was the last thing he needed. He flopped back down against his makeshift home of the last 3 days. It was little more than several leaf-laden branches draped over a fallen log, but it had done the job. At least this spot wasn't covered in poison oak, unlike the location he chose on his first night. Now he had a rash that itched like crazy, refused to leave, and a god that was exactly zero help. In fact, Arkesh spent all of his time eating, right in front of him, chowing down on rotten bark and dead leaves like the forest was a buffet. But he was doing it. He was sticking to his plan. Drowning in his ever-growing, maddening spiral of thoughts, Eric was more than grateful when something yanked him from his stupor. It was the most heavenly scent he had smelled on the air in 3 days. Potato and onion stew. Oh, he remembered that camping staple from his youth. His stomach gave a loud grumble as the delicious aroma practically pulled him from his hiding spot like those old cartoons. People must be arriving for the Octobu Bigfoot hunt. Food, water, and fire. All the things he needed. All the things he would trade his last 3 toes for. And all the things he couldn't risk it for. Just a little bit longer, he told himself. That thought fortified Eric's resolve, and he was ready to hunker back down into his shelter, and then the smell of hot cocoa wafted through the air. He closed his eyes, breathing it in deep, allowing it to draw him closer. He remembered this trip, quite vividly actually, and they hadn't arrived until lunchtime. He distinctly recalled stumbling out of the truck and right into a bowl of that amazing, delicious stew. He glanced up at the sky, squinting for the sun. It had only been up for a few hours, so Eric rationalized he had time. He could pop in, grab a bite, warm up by the fire, and make a break for it well before lunch. All this ran through his dehydration-addled mind as he stumbled along the path, clutching at the trees to keep his balance. Apparently, his stomach had been driving the body, following the hypnotizing scent of food. And in less than half an hour, his feet brought him to the edge of a campfire glow. He spotted several campers tossing more vegetables into a large, cast-iron pot hanging over the fire pit. Given the conversation, laughter, and horror stories of Bigfoot encounters, Eric determined this was a friendly bunch. Surely they'd be willing to share. He longed for the warmth of the fire, the cocoa they passed around, and, licking his lips, one of those fresh, hot, buttery biscuits. So strong was his hunger, his stomach continued to draw him towards the campers, and he hadn't noticed just how close he was until he stumbled on several twigs, snapping them loudly. "Oh my God, it's Bigfoot!" a round woman shouted, jumping to her feet and yanking out her disposable camera, snapping off a picture before winding the dial to snap another. The others followed suit, and the bright bursts of light caused Eric to wail, throwing his hands over his face and crying out in pain as the pops of color blinded him. He knew he was dirty and disheveled, his hair and beard reaching new levels of scraggly, and given the amount of mud that now caked him, he wasn't the least bit surprised they thought him a cryptid. "I'm not Bigfoot!" He managed to lower his hands and slapped on a dashing smile, waiting for the hectic photo shoot to die down. When the last burst of light faded, he squeezed out a plausible lie. I got separated from my hiking party. I've been out here for 3 days. "Oh, you poor thing!" The plump woman approached, offering up her serape, a type of colorful wool poncho. "Take this and come get warmed up." Eric allowed himself to be tugged towards an empty chair that sat closest to the fire. He pulled the brightly covered garment on over his head as he sat down, the sudden burst of heat causing an uncontrollable shiver. And before he had time to thank those around him, he was handed a bowl of stew and a cup of hot cocoa.
"Looks like you've got a bad case of frostbite,"
an older man pointed out, reclaiming his seat and nodding to the newcomer's hands.
"We're pretty far in the woods, but we can radio the forest rangers and have them—"
No! Nearly dropping the spoon into his bowl of stew, Eric waved off the kind gesture with a nervous laugh.
No, this is just,
Finding another lie was like trying to force a lemon through a straw, but thankfully one came to him.
A tattoo. Yes, that is what this is.
He knew his smile was unconvincing, but he hoped this group of people were too nice to notice.
You know, dumb teenage nonsense.
Don't I know it?
Serape woman elbowed him playfully as she took the empty chair beside him.
When I was 18, I got a tattoo of H.R. Pufnstuf on my arm. Nobody knows who he is now.
She sighed.
How did you get lost from your group?
Oh, I stumbled into a mud pit.
His grin only widened as Eric continued with his lie, the food and warmth starting to thaw his aching mind. He elaborated profusely about a bear, some bees, and, to throw in some common cryptid beliefs, blamed his confusion on aliens. As the saying went, know your audience. They ate it up, and he spent the next hour regaling his fellow campers, Jerry, Fiona, and the twins, Sasha and Reese, with stories of Bigfoot hunts he used to join his dad on when he was younger. He was so entangled with these tales that he hadn't noticed a new arrival joining their party, not until they plopped a bag down on an empty chair near the fire.
Fellow footers, how's it going?
Eric choked on his hot cocoa when he looked up to see his father not 2 feet from him. He dropped his mug as he fumbled to hide the shock of white in his hair beneath the beanie and sunk deeper into his serape.
Zachariah, it's so good you could finally make it.
Jerry leaned forward, resting his hands on top of his cane.
Managed to get away from that old ball and chain, eh? You leave my wife alone, old man.
Zachariah laughed, shaking his head as his own hand found the top of his son's young head, ruffling Vel's hair.
But yes, she let me have this.
Quickly returning his empty mug to his lips, Eric attempted to hide behind the small tin cup. His heart had returned to that uncomfortable, hammering pace as he stared up at his dad. It wasn't even close to lunchtime. What was he doing here?
What's this? Fresh blood!
Zachariah barked a laugh as he extended a hand.
Hey, friend, welcome to the fest.
Jerry nodded at the poor boy.
This one got lost in the woods. Scared Fiona half to death when he popped out of the trees like old Sasquatch himself.
He wavered a moment before Eric managed to tentatively raise a hand, taking his father's.
Hi,
he said in a deep voice, and threw on another award-winning, unconvincing smile. There was a bob of their hands, up and down, before he pulled away and sighed in relief when his dad turned his back on them.
They'll do me a favor and take our stuff.
Zachariah pointed vaguely into the distance.
Over to our campsite.
Oh, can't Eric do it? I want to read my book.
Zachariah ran a hand over his face before he dropped into a squat, clamping that same hand on his son's shoulder.
Your brother is asleep in the car.
But...
And...
Zachariah raised his voice, cutting off the interruption.
We want to have everything done before he wakes up, or he'll spend the entire time complaining about spiders and, I don't know, rabid squirrels or something.
He smiled.
If we're lucky, he won't wake up until closer to lunch.
With a huff, Vel relented and grabbed the bag, dragging it away from the fire.
Okay. Think, damn it!
Eric's whole stay-out-of-trouble plan was unraveling faster than the beanie on his head. He was also a little miffed at the casual way his dad insulted his concerns. I mean, hello? They were all the way out here in the very real nature, hunting for very unreal threats amidst other very real threats. Either way, he needed to leave. And now, before he was spotted, Eric smiled at the others, but none of them were paying him any mind, so he quietly jumped to his feet and...
Excuse me?
A hand landed on his shoulder and Eric leapt out of his skin, spinning and stumbling. He flailed, latching onto the only thing he could, his dad. And then, in a jumbled mess of thrashing limbs, his metal toes accidentally kicked Zachariah in the shin, who, in turn, jerked in pain, slamming his knee directly into Eric's groin. He wheezed, staggering back as he clutched himself, struggling to capture his breath and remain upright. Zachariah winced, rubbing at his shin and feeling the goose egg already growing there.
Sorry. I didn't mean to sneak up on you.
Air had yet to return to Eric, but between the gasps for breath and the blinding pain, he managed to croak out,
"No worries. My fault. I was just looking for the administrator's tent."
Jerry, wincing at Eric's predicament, rose to the occasion.
"Oh, Ray? He's on the other side of the campground. But, I'll take you."
Saved from having to interfere anymore with his timeline, Eric waddled away towards the trees. He slumped into a bush, convincing his brain to keep the food in his stomach.
"Don't throw up! Don't throw up! Don't throw up!"
He repeated his mantra until the pain subsided and he was finally able to sit up. He grumbled as he climbed to his feet, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other, waiting for things to realign as he glanced over his shoulder. The others around the campfire were laughing, while Sasha and Reese were in a dramatic reenactment of what had just transpired. Silently, he hoped all their s'mores caught fire later that night. He stumbled into the cover of the forest, away from the campers, and began searching his surroundings.
"Arkesh!"
he hissed in a whisper, whacking at bushes and kicking at leaves, rather redundantly, as a tortoise of that size could hardly go amiss. He stopped when he heard a loud thwack and a triumphant yell. Eric leaned around a large cedar tree to see his little brother, Vel, brandishing a very handsome stick like a sword. He swished it back and forth, performing clumsy pirouettes and attacking a large boulder.
"Back, foul beast! I will slay you and save the princess!"
Vel slapped the rock again, and Eric realized with a start that it wasn't a stone at all, but his missing deity taxi driver. He was just thinking how appropriate it was, seeing his brother battle yet another god, when the little twerp knelt before Arkesh, poking at him with that fine specimen of a stick.
"You've got some interesting markings."
Vel moved his makeshift sword out of the way every time as the giant turtle tried to snap at it, clearly hungry for the single leaf still stuck to a lone twig at the end.
"But I've got some bad news. Red isn't a good camel frog color."
He paused, stroking at his chin, like he'd seen his father do often enough, and laughed when an idea came to him.
"I bet Dad would let me take you home."
"Oh, no, that's not good."
Eric's heart rate ratcheted up again, compelling his mush of a brain to work. He needed a way to get Vel to leave without risking the timeline. And then a beautiful, brilliant idea struck him, and he jumped out from behind his tree, belting out, "Ooh-ga-booga-booga-booga!" Vel dropped his stick and ran, screaming his little head off, and Eric suppressed a laugh to see his brother, a man he knew now to be fearless, grizzled, and stoic, crying in fear at the monster in the woods. Snatching up that exquisite stick, Eric gave it a few good swings. His brother had good taste, he'd give him that. With a wide smile, he tapped Arkesh on the shell with it.
"What say we make like a tree and leave?"
Truly, you have not lived until you've seen a tortoise roll its eyes in disgust.
"Will somebody take this damned thing off my neck?"
Hollow yelled, nearly knocking over one of the many physicers that swarmed around him as he tugged on the iron collar still locked in place. The constant pain it was causing was more of a nuisance than agony, unlike the torment from his left shoulder blade, which was hardly more than a bloody stump where his wing used to be. And that was to say nothing of the tattered, gnarled remains of the other one on his right side, all but decimated by the teal flames. The healers fluttered around him like moths to a candle inside his tent, pleading with him to return to the castle where he could be properly treated. Hollow found his patience ebbing with each nattering question, with each dab of ointment or alcohol, with each reminder that he was now a freak, a pitiful excuse for a fey prince. Judging by the sheer amount of bandages that had been applied to his person, Hollow reasoned that his once beautiful visage had been marred and ruined beyond repair by the Shade-Eaters and the Teal Flames. As a lowly soldier set to work on removing his collar, he hissed and seethed with each press of iron onto his skin. He raised a hand to rebuke the clumsy oaf, but was interrupted when the flap of his tent pulled back to reveal one of his scouts, presumably with word of the Elven brothers. The man balked at the gruesome sight of his prince, but covered his reaction with a stiff bow.
"We've tracked them to the river, sire. They are following it as we speak."
A sneer curled Hollow's lips, and he nodded.
"Good. Block their path. Stay their movements by any means." "As you say, sire."
A physicker distracted him long enough for the scout to depart unnoticed, but Hollow did not miss the absence of a respectful bow. Growling under his breath, he snatched a silver tray from the hands of a young fay, sending bottles and gauze tumbling to the ground as he raised it to examine himself in its mirrored surface. His stomach dropped, rage numbing every nerve in his body as Hollow stared at his scarred visage. Lines of bubbled and burned tissue ran up the right side of his neck and face. He had lost 3/4 of his ear, and much of his hair and eyebrow were gone, leaving only singed soot in their place. He released a feral scream as he hurled the tray to the ground, scattering the attending fay. His gaze landed on the giant wrought-iron cage, and for a brief moment his twisted scowl flickered into a sadistic grin. At least one of his entourage could be trusted, and as he gripped the edge of the blanketing sheet, Hollow knew Kalos was deserving of a reward. The covering slid free, and the fire inside flared anew. It roared to life, and the little shadowy creatures inside jolted with vigor. They snapped their teeth at one another, climbing the bars of the cage, and let out a cacophony of snarling noises. Hollow took the silver gauntlet from the cage guard and slid it over his fingers. He traced the designs etched into each wrought iron bar, runes crafted to contain the inhabitants, until a curious shadow bug came to investigate. He scratched it beneath its chin, smiling wickedly at the cooing noise it made. "Be ready, my little beasties. Today you will earn your rewards."
Are you even trying?
Eric glanced over his shoulder warily before shooting his attention back to the massive black and red tortoise, attempting to help hoist it onto the large, flat plank of wood.
"We need to move further into the forest."
Impatient with the god's speed, he pushed his shoulder into Arkesh's shell, hoping this might motivate the beast into climbing aboard his makeshift sled. It didn't. The tortoise was much too distracted by a small plot of sweetgrass. The giant animal was too heavy to bully into doing anything it didn't want to, and Eric slumped into the dirt with a long, drawn-out groan. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the darkening sky. Night was swiftly approaching, and while it'd make traversing the forest more difficult, they'd at least have the cover of darkness. Plus, even at this glacial speed, they had traveled far enough north that they should be safe from prying eyes. Thank goodness moss always grew facing north, or he would have been walking in circles all day. Like the rhyme said, moss grows to the north, nature's compass, blah, blah, blah. Naturally, of course, it was during this soul-comforting thought that he heard the low murmur of chatter, and he sat bolt upright. Pinpricks of dim lantern light were bobbing in through the forest like fairies moving from one house to the next, and Eric groaned loudly. He glanced up at the tree nearest him, which he now realized had moss on both sides. Oh, right. Moss grows to the north, nature's compass, except where there's shade, then it's anyone's guess. Turns out he had been walking in circles all day. He shook a fist at it in anger.
Stupid moss poem! Put the important part first next time!
But as he looked back at the group of campers heading in his direction, he panicked. The last thing these cryptid hunters needed to see was a monstrous reptile with a shell glittering like magma. Eric groaned. Moving a mountain would be easier than convincing Arkesh to quicken its pace. So he bent and fumbled around in the leaves and grasses until he found what he needed. He plucked up a rock, rolling it in his hand before he stood and, choosing a direction at random, lobbed it into the forest. It flew further than he would have expected before it smacked into the bark of a tree with a resounding thunk, and the group of campers froze.
Hear that?
Zechariah took the lead spot of the group, holding up his lantern, though it wasn't dark enough for the bright white light to do anything but blind anyone looking at him, to gesture in the direction of the noise.
Something threw a rock. That's classic Bigfoot behavior.
Eric chuckled in triumph. They were far enough away that his hiding spot would still be out of sight as they went on a wild goose chase the other way. There were new voices among those Eric recognized of the campers, and he sighed in relief when they all suggested they make for the area where the stone had landed. But that sigh turned into a scoff of disbelief when his dad suggested a different strategy.
No. We have to go in the opposite direction the rock hit. That's where the Bigfoot is. It's a distraction tactic.
Zechariah lifted his lantern once more.
I'm sure it came from this way.
Oh, crap! Eric danced on the spot. He only had maybe a minute before they arrived, and his companion moved at the speed of continental drift. He haphazardly piled loose branches and leaves over the tortoise, hoping it was dark enough to be sufficient, then dove into the nearest thicket of bushes to hide.
Ow, thorns hurt,
he grumbled to himself as he wriggled further into the shrub, the burrs pulling at his serape.
Oh, I think I see something over here.
Fiona's voice came from somewhere to Eric's right, and he felt his heart sink, assuming they had discovered Arkesh. But as he chanced peering through the leaves, he spotted her a few dozen yards away, tugging on a wad of antler velvet stuck in some low-hanging branches. Jerry swooped in on her, his own excitement brimming as he nodded in agreement.
Let's head this way, footers.
Zechariah began waving for the rest of the group to follow, and waited for them to pass, kneeling before his two children once they had.
Kids, you know the drill. We don't know how aggressive they will be when cornered, so...
He clapped his eldest on the shoulder.
Eric, I want you to watch your brother. Under no circumstances should either of you leave this spot.
What if there's a bear? Zechariah sighed.
Unless there's a bear.
He smiled at Eric, and then his youngest son, who made a tiny whimper.
But I promise we won't go far, okay? If Bigfoot isn't around that next bend, I'll come right back.
He stood, handing one of the boys his lantern. He turned, ready to reunite with the group, took one step, and promptly stopped. He spun back around, narrowing his eyes down at his kids.
No fighting.
The Eric, being pincushioned to death by an angry shrub, exhaled, slumping in his hiding spot as he watched his father rejoin the other campers. Okay, so now he just had to wait for the two brothers to get bored and wander off. Because, well, that's what all 8- and 10-year-old boys do. It took all of 60 seconds before Vel lost interest in the woods and plucked up another stick from beneath a pile of leaves. He waved it around a few times, realizing it was the same one from earlier, and smiled. Then immediately turned and whacked his brother with it. Ew! Little Eric rubbed at his arm for a moment and slapped at his sibling when the pain faded. What was that for?
I'm bored.
Vel thrust his stick at his brother again, pretending he was bravely fending off a beast of the forest. Little Eric, who had been dutifully cataloging all the sounds and evidence in his journal, like he always did, rolled his eyes in exasperation.
Well, I don't want to play.
Vel huffed and started walking away, smacking his sword into every tree and rock.
Fine. I'm gonna go find Bigfoot then.
No, you're not. Little Eric made a few more notes in his book, not bothering to look up.
Dad said to stay here. Dad said to stay here.
Stop mocking me.
Stop mocking me.
Fine. Get eaten by a... Ah! As Vel's stick sword plunged into a bush, a garbled cry of pain erupted from within, shocking both of them into silence. Little Eric dropped his journal. It's a bear! Hands flying over his head, he turned tail and ran. Dad! The Eric in hiding jumped from the bush, one hand pressed against a very sore eye that had nearly been blinded, the other held out in a placating, and let's face it, pleading gesture. But it was too late. By the time he got free of the brambles, his younger self was long gone. Vel, however, was staring at him with wide-eyed horror. Eric could see that tiny mind registering the monster from earlier, and then saw the child taking in a deep lungful of air to scream. Nope, no! Future Eric panicked, all sense of logic flying out the window as he lunged and snatched up his little brother, clamping a hand tight around his mouth to stop the sound from carrying. Don't scream! Please! As the child squirmed and scratched at him like a feral cat, Eric realized just how, for the lack of a better word, bad this situation looked. Here he was, dressed like some crazed forest hermit, filthy and bedraggled, holding an 8-year-old child while covering his mouth to keep him from screaming. He let out a nervous chuckle and smiled unconvincingly. I'm not going to hurt you. It's me, Eric. Well, an older version, but I'm still your brother. Ow! Vel's teeth sank into his palm, and Eric dropped the boy without thinking. There was a muffled crunch and a miserable cry of pain, and he looked down to see his little brother cradling his right wrist, which was bent at a funny angle. Oh, that's not good. Eric, frozen in the motion of bending down to help, realized just how quickly this entire endeavor had spiraled out of control. These campers would surely hogtie him and carry him down the mountain to the police. Or maybe mob mentality would take over and they would just... Yeah, this wasn't good. And to make matters worse, he could already hear the crash of bodies quickly heading their way. He picked a direction at random and bolted, ignoring the painful clawing of low-hanging branches in the dark. He didn't stop running until he tripped over something large and landed face first into the dirt. Eric's chest was heaving, and he wheezed out a groan at the burning in his shin, his lungs, and his nose. But any sound of torch-wielding mob was long behind him. He had no idea how far he had run, or to where, and at this point, it didn't matter. After an agonizing few moments, he struggled to roll over onto his back. Standing before him, staring down with a narrowed gaze, was Arkesh. Great, Eric thought, managing to sit up and rub at his sore shins. Now the damn thing chooses to move fast. Before he could open his mouth to explain, the god spoke.
We are done here.
Without any preamble, the tortoise's head connected with his outstretched foot, and Eric found himself being squeezed in the confines of swirling red light. He really needed to come up with a term for this. Perhaps the temporal time travel vacuum? TTTV was a horrible acronym. After a scant few moments of discomfort, his backside collided painfully with a warm stone floor. He cried out with what little air was left in his lungs and remained there, struggling to breathe. At least the balmy volcanic air was soothing his frozen joints.
Well, that could have gone better.
Eric managed words when he was able to breathe once more, and he forced himself to sit up. The giant mechanical body of Arkesh swayed slightly, and it turned its massive head to gaze down upon him.
Indeed.
So, now what?
Eric stared up into the bright red eyes of the god expectantly, knowing he was being judged.
You fail.
What? Eric was on his feet in an instant.
But I didn't change anything. My dad is still out there, ready to leave my mom and us in a few years.
He took a step forward, desperate to change the creature's mind.
Isn't that what you wanted?
What we want is irrelevant. You altered the past. Your brother's wrist was broken.
Arkesh blinked.
The timeline is altered.
A flutter of fear and hope gripped Eric's heart.
Does that mean my father doesn't leave?
Calculating likelihood.
Something flashed in the creature's eyes, and it took Eric a breath to realize it was code. The god was running computations to consider the long-term ramifications of his actions. Despite being impressed, Eric couldn't help but be a little miffed. Something like that would have been useful a bit earlier.
Negative. Timeline integrity 98.7% intact.
Confused, Eric frowned at the answer.
I don't see the problem then?
That is an unacceptable deviation.
What? Eric felt the need to move, the urge to do something with the pounding of the blood in his veins.
I tried my best at every turn. I half starved myself, nearly died out there.
He thrust a hand out behind him.
All to avoid changing the future. I did the right thing. Doesn't that count for something?
Right and wrong are inconsequential.
Arkesh shuffled to take in the tiny half-elf before him, adjusting his gaze until he could see the creature fully.
Morality is not a factor. Considering the potential damage you can cause without time sight.
Not a factor? Not a factor? Eric balked at the knowledge he would always choose wrong, no matter the path he took.
Kedione and the other gods sure seemed to think morality played a big part in it. And what the hell is time sight?
The others are short-sighted.
He opened his hands out in front of him in supplication.
If this isn't to get me to do the right thing, then what is it all for? What do you want from me?
Those red, glowing embers were replaced by flashing code once more, and Eric groaned, massaging the bridge of his nose.
Any change or lack of change could affect the timeline adversely. Without the ability to see the branches and paths of time, every mistake leads to more variations. 98.7 becomes 97.2, then 96.4, and so on.
Bullcrap! Eric dropped his hands, clenching them into fists at his sides as anger burned away his desperation.
By that logic, the only way I could win your stupid little trials is to never change anything.
Except what must be changed.
Arkesh let out a long hiss of steam pluming from his nostrils.
Retrocausality.
Resisting the urge to break something, Eric returned to pacing instead, barely controlling his outrage. Just by arriving in the past, it caused the possibility that he was always meant to have done so, that he was supposed to change something. The stupid tortoise implied that he had to change those things, but not anything else. If he disturbed the wrong pile of trash, stepped on the wrong butterfly, or failed to step on the right one, every trip would lead him incrementally closer to unraveling reality. He let out a bark of hysterical laughter. And how the hell am I supposed to be able to figure out the difference? It's impossible!
Without time sight, yes.
I don't even know what that is.
Eric tossed his hands into the air.
That's not fair!
Arkesh blinked down at the little elf slowly, considering his words.
Chronomancy holds an incalculable potential for destruction. It is the greatest threat to all existence.
He let out another hiss of steam.
It is not meant to be fair.
Eric dropped to the balls of his feet, cradling his head in his hands. He had failed. After all he had gone through, after wasting another chance to save his dad and fix his own shortcomings and repair his broken family, only to find out that it was rigged from the start. And now he was one no away from being chucked into a black hole by a coterie of simple-minded celestial beings. He looked up, desperation lacing his words.
How is anyone supposed to calculate the exact changes necessary? How am I?
Silence permeated the stifling hot air, causing Eric to stand, opening his mouth to repeat himself when the god averted its gaze.
I do not think you can.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
It was right over here! Oh my god, Vel, are you alright?
It was big and hairy and it jumped right out of that bush.
Oh no, your wrist. Come here, buddy.
It was coming right at me, but I ran to distract it.
Does this hurt? Yep, it's broken.
I told Vel not to wander off, but he didn't listen. He said...
Eric! No bear I've ever heard of is just going to break a child's wrist and wander off. You were obviously fighting, like I told you not to, and Vel got hurt.
Nuh-uh, I wasn't even here.
Eric?
Just ask him. It was a bear.
Well, buddy, what happened? How did you get hurt?
Eric did it. I did not. Dad, he's lying.
I don't want to hear it. Just go find us some small branches we can use to make a splint, okay?
Fine.
All right, little man. Now, we're gonna be brave about this, right? No more crying?
Yeah.
That's my trooper. Okay, so here's the deal. What's it gonna take to get you to tell your mom this happened in a parking lot on the way home and not while I left you alone in the woods? You want s'mores? Ice cream?
If we get ice cream, can I have Eric's too?
Hey!